So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case, another serial killer case, another UK serial killer case. These are my favourite cases to cover, and of course, it's a two-parter. This is part one of two. We've got two-parters in 1 month. I'm on a roll. This is a case that I've wanted to cover for so long because it happened pretty close to where I grew up. So I've heard stories all the way through my life about like this case and like the guy. I've known people that have like connections to this case, to like the victims, to the families. And I've just always wanted to cover it, but I knew it was going to be a lot of work. So I've put it off, but I can't put it off any longer. I need to cover it. So here we are today for the first part of the Crossbow Cannibal case. But before we get into it, I just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Hunter Killer. Hunter Killer is a murder mystery game subscription box shipped right to your door every single month. Each box has a bunch of evidence, a bunch of clues in it to help you solve your own murder case. Right now, the box is following the story of a woman named Julie Adler who has just found the remains of a dead actress in her parents' theatre that have been there for almost 100 years. And now she needs your help trying to figure out who this woman is, who did this to her, and why this happened to her. Each box is full of new evidence. Like I said, there's case files, information booklets from the theatre, there's old letters, all with clues hidden inside them for you to discover. Hunter Killer is perfect for this time of year when we're all meeting up with friends, meeting up with family. Of course, we can't really do that much these days, so Hunter Killer is perfect to do on Zoom when you're meeting up with your friends, meeting up with your family. You could all work on it together from the comfort of your own homes. I think it's the perfect replacement for like a date night or a girls' night or like family games night. And it's so much cheaper than all the things that we used to do for date night, girls' night, family games night this time last year, all the drinks, all the meals. It's so much cheaper. And I think it's the perfect Christmas gift if you have any true crime lovers in your life. I know I would love to receive a Hunter Killer box for Christmas. Make sure you get your order in by the 15th of this month though, to make sure it's guaranteed to get to your person by Christmas. Part of the proceeds of every single Hunter Killer box goes towards the Cold Case Foundation, which I think is amazing. They work to try and solve cold cases and get victims and their families some justice. So if you want to try Hunter Killer, they are very kindly offering you guys 20% off of your first box when you go through my link, which is hunterkiller.com/Eleanor Neale, and use code Eleanor at checkout. Thank you so much to Hunter Killer again for sponsoring this video. Now let's get into it. But before we do, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So this case takes place in 2009-2010 kind of time in Bradford in West Yorkshire in England. So sometimes it's also known as the Bradford murders, but it's more commonly known as the Crossbow Cannibal case. Now, Bradford, let's set the scene in terms of where this took place. So Bradford is labelled the most dangerous city in the whole of the UK, and it's pretty close to home. It's like a lot of people from Bradford don't want to admit that they're from Bradford. I know a lot of people that live like on the outskirts of Bradford, and you just kind of say that you're from Leeds or you're from Huddersfield or Wakefield. Like, you don't want to say that you're from Bradford. I mean, the outskirts really isn't that bad at all. It's actually quite nice on the outskirts of Bradford in some places. I'm making it sound like hell, but it's not. But Bradford, just in terms of the crime rates and things like that, it's not the most safe place in the UK at all. The Yorkshire Ripper, who was one of the UK's most notorious serial killers, was from Bradford. He was born in Bradford, did a few of his kills in Bradford. I've done a video on him. If you want to watch that, I'll link it up in the eye for you to watch after this. Donald Neilson was another Bradford serial killer, not to be confused with Dennis Neilson, which is a Scottish serial killer. All these serial killers ruining the good Neale name. There's serious grooming gangs in Bradford. There's serial rapists. There's a huge drug problem. There's a lot of illegal prostitution as well. A lot of sex work that is carried out illegally through pimps or through brothels. You know, it's not It's not safe. There's nothing regulated. I mean, there's nothing regulated in a lot of places in the world, but issues with things like that are just higher in Bradford. But now you have an idea of the kind of area that we're talking. We have high unemployment rates, which come hand in hand with high crime rates, usually. It's quite a poor area, quite a impoverished area is Bradford. It's not, you know, the poorest area in the UK, but it's also not booming with economic wealth. On June 22nd, 2009, a 43-year-old woman named Suzanne Rushworth seemingly disappeared. She stopped contacting her friends, stopped contacting her family, and no one could locate her. Susan worked as a sex worker in the red light district of Bradford, and she also struggled with a few drug addictions, most notably heroin. And for those two reasons, it wasn't entirely unusual for her to go missing like this. She would often go missing for a day or two at a time whenever she was with clients or if she was on drugs or something. But what was unusual here was the lack of contact with her family. Whether she was out for a couple of days with a client, she would always be texting either her brother or her mother, maybe her children. But when she stopped texting them on this particular day, she left home and never came back. She wasn't in contact with anyone. That was when they knew that something was wrong. Susan had a pretty normal childhood from what I could see. I think everything was fine. She was pretty close with her brother Paul growing up, and then when she became an adult, she was very close with her mother. As she'd gotten into her 20s, Susan got married and she had 2 children. Her life was going amazingly. However, when she reached her 30s, this marriage began breaking down and her husband actually left her. At this point, she has a different job, she has no drug dependencies, she's living a quote-unquote normal life. Following this split with her husband, Susan stayed single for a while, and then eventually she found another man, rather unexpectedly, and she fell pregnant with him. And so she continued this relationship, everything was well, until it wasn't anymore, and this man also left her. So now she was a single mother to 3 children, and she was struggling. She felt a lot of pressure because she had a single mother's wage and she had 4 mouths to feed. She was very depressed and she was seeking something to relieve some of this sorrow, and in that desperation, that was when Susan began turning to Class A drugs. She did a lot of different drugs at first. She was trying cocaine, she was trying everything just to kind of give her something, give her some kind of energy back. And then eventually she fell into heroin more and became very severely addicted. Her usage became more and more frequent in her 30s, and then by the end of her 30s, she was struggling really badly to keep up financially, both with her addiction and also just in general in her life, paying her bills, feeding herself. By now, her 2 oldest children were adults, and I believe the 3rd one was with the father. I'm not entirely sure. So I think she was just feeding herself at this point. Susan no longer had a job due to her addiction. She couldn't work, and so she was just on benefits, but she knew that she needed another income, a more substantial income, but she couldn't go and get a job. So instead, Susan decided to become a sex worker, and she went out onto the red light district in Bradford. She started working a couple of nights a week, earning a little bit of extra cash, until eventually it became every single night. Although this money wouldn't last very long, she would pay her bills, she would pay her rent, and then the rest of the money would go on drugs. And Susan was becoming very, very ill. At this point, she hadn't told her family that she was working on the streets, that she was a sex worker. She, as far as they were aware, she was just on benefits, and that was just how she was getting by. However, one night, a family friend saw her on the road, on Thornton Road, which is the kind of infamous red light district in Bradford, and they informed her family, and that was how they found out. Of course, they were absolutely heartbroken, and they were very worried about Susan because it was clear that she didn't really want to be doing this, but she felt that she had to be able to afford this addiction. And now she was in like a vicious cycle of sex work, earning the money, spending it on drugs, having no money, going back to sex work. Her family tried to get her to stop both the drugs and the sex work so many times, but you know, when someone is so deeply addicted to a substance, they're going to do whatever it takes to get that substance. And it actually got to the point where her mother was so desperate to help her daughter that she actually paid for Susan to go through rehab. And Susan was willing to go, she completed it, and she was doing really well. However, after 3 months of being out of rehab, she was back on the drugs and back into this vicious cycle of drugs and sex work. Only this time, her brother believes it was even more severe. She was taking even more drugs, she was taking even more clients or punters. And then in the summer of 2009, Susan finally decided that enough was enough when one of her children actually had their own child. And Susan knew that she wanted to be a grandmother. She wanted to be involved. She wanted to be there in her grandchild's life. And she couldn't do that if she was addicted to drugs. And so she decided that she was gonna get herself clean and she was gonna get off the drugs. She was gonna get a stable job and be, you know, a good grandmother to her grandchild. She went to the doctors and got herself a prescription for methadone, which is the drug that they give you when they're trying to wean you off heroin. It's like a substitute so that you don't get all the withdrawal symptoms. And it was actually when she was on the way to pick up this methadone prescription from the chemist that she disappeared. And on the day of her disappearance, Susan was actually 5 weeks clean of every single drug, including heroin. And things were looking really positive for Susan Rushworth. So what happened to her on the day that she disappeared? Usually when she would go off for a day or two, it would be either because of drugs or because of sex work. But right now, her family thought she was doing neither of those things. Her mother was the last person to see Susan that day. She'd actually been at her mother's home and then left there around 1 p.m. and got the bus into Bradford city centre to go and pick up this methadone prescription. That same evening, her mother and her brother both tried to contact her, text her, call her, anything, but she didn't pick up her phone. And so over the following days, they still tried to text her, tried to call her, but still nothing. And then eventually when the mother and the brother spoke to each other about it and realised that neither of them had been in contact with Susan, they realised that something was wrong, and so that was when they reported it to the police. So police launched the search to find Susan Rushworth, and one of the first things they did was go down to the red light district in Bradford and speak to a bunch of the women down there, some of them that knew Susan, and asked if they'd seen or heard anything from her for a few days. But none of them had. They said that they hadn't seen her working in a while, and, you know, they'd let police know if they saw anything. So police went and spoke with a few of the people that they knew Susan would either take drugs with or buy drugs from. I'm not entirely sure how this dynamic worked because a lot of the sources I read said that police went and questioned drug dealers. I mean, if police are questioning drug dealers, why are they not arresting them? I don't know. But somehow that was a thing. But none of the drug dealers had sold to Susan in a while and they hadn't heard from her or seen her. They also asked some men that regularly solicited sex workers on that street that Susan would often work, but again, none of them had seen or heard from her. Her brother Paul was actually so desperate that he was going and doing his own unofficial questionings. So he would go down to the red light district when police, you know, clocked out for the evening. They'd finished their searches. He was like, no, we need to keep going. We need to keep asking questions. So he would go down to the red light district, speak with all the girls. He would speak with anyone that he possibly could that he thought might know anything about Susan's whereabouts. Her family, her children went on TV and did a public appeal for anyone that had any information relating to their mother's disappearance to come forward. As weeks turned into months, the family began preparing themselves for the worst possible outcome, and that was that they might not find Susan Rushworth alive. Police had managed to track down both her mobile phone and her credit card, not physically track them down, but track the records, and they found that she hadn't used her phone and she hadn't used her bank card since the day that she went missing, which of course is not a good sign. So police began searches for a body. They began searching wooded areas, bodies of water. Perhaps she'd taken her own life from the struggle of, you know, trying to get clean off these drugs or trying to find a job. Maybe the stress of life was just too much for her. Or maybe she'd taken drugs again and maybe she'd overdosed or something. Police had no idea, but because it had been so long without any contact or without anyone seeing her, they believed that she likely was dead. Nothing came up in these searches, like, at all, and so police began contacting local hospitals, local rehab centres, thinking, well, maybe she's checked herself into one. Police found absolutely nothing in these searches, which I suppose is kind of a good sign, but also at the same time, there's just so much worry surrounding this. Police began checking local hospitals and rehab centres, hoping that maybe she'd checked herself in to help herself. That would explain why she wasn't using her phone or her bank card or anything, but none of them had any documentation of Susan Rushworth being admitted. The family continued campaigning for Susan's safe return all the way through into the next year, when it was around that time that another woman, very similar to Susan, also went missing. 31-year-old Shelley Armitage was reported missing on April 26th, 2010, almost a full year after Susan. And Shelley had a very similar life to Susan Rushworth. She also worked as a sex worker on the same road in the red light district in Bradford. I think she actually knew Susan when they both worked there, because she was also one of the women that Susan's brother Paul would come down and question and speak to and ask if they'd seen Susan. And Shelley was very well known as a sex worker. She was very popular, not only among, of course, the men. They really liked her because she was pretty, but also all the women. She was just a very bubbly, very lively character. She had a lot of friends in her kind of work. She was well respected as well. Like, she'd been in it for a while. People knew her name. People knew who Shelley Armitage was. Shelley's absolute dream in life was to become a model, and she was so beautiful. Her family thought she genuinely had so much potential because she was gorgeous. But then she kind of fell into this lifestyle, and then that dream of becoming a model felt further and further away by the day. Shelley was also severely addicted to Class A drugs. She had been since she was like 16, so nearly half of her life. Again, it was mainly heroin. She was also addicted to alcohol. She was an alcoholic. And all of this just made her life such a struggle. It meant that she had to work 10 times harder as a sex worker to pay for both addictions, plus food, plus a place to stay. She fell into her drug addictions and her alcohol addictions, like I said, when she was very, very young, through being involved in the party scene. You know, it started with a little bit of experimenting. Her friends were doing drugs, so she tried them, and then one thing led to another. It snowballed, and then she had severe addictions. And she would often tell people on the street, you know, that she was going to be a model one day. Once she sorted her life out, she got clean off the drugs, she got a stable job, she was going to try and be a model again. She was very, very close with her family, and they supported her as much as they possibly could in life. They encouraged her to try to get off the drugs, to try to get a stable job. They were really helping her to try get clean, and it worked to a degree. Shelley was also on methadone at the time of her disappearance, just like Susan was. She had a boyfriend named Craig that she lived with. The two of them had a puppy. They had their own flat. Everything was looking good. It was looking like she was going to be clean off the drugs, then she was going to get a stable job, and, you know, things were looking so positive for Shelley Armitage. On the day of her disappearance, Shelley was on the phone to her sister, and she said that she was busy right then, but she was going to call her later that night. However, she never made that second call. And when she failed to come home that night to her boyfriend, she failed to contact him, the family knew that something was wrong. When the family reported the disappearance to the police, they looked into it and they found that for the next month or two, Shelley stopped picking up her methadone prescription, which was unusual of her because she really wanted to get off of heroin. She was excited to be on methadone. I mean, it was hard for her, but she was willing to put in that work because she wanted, you know, a normal life back. But aside from the methadone, okay, so say she just decided that she didn't want to be on methadone anymore. She decided to stop taking it and go back to heroin. What was confusing and very concerning was that she stopped collecting her government benefits money, which meant she had no money, unless she was just living off of the money from her sex work. But I don't know, this was two unusual behaviours. It concerned her family. She wasn't coming home. Something was wrong. So police went and spoke with other sex workers in the red light district of Bradford once again. Bear in mind right now, These two cases aren't linked. Police haven't connected the two. There's no reason for them to connect the two, really. But they go and they talk to all of these women in the red light district, and none of them had seen or heard from Shelley in a while. After trolling through hours and hours of CCTV footage in the general area where Shelley worked, so that's the thing about this particular red light district road in Bradford, is that it doesn't have cameras on, or at least it didn't at this time. I don't know if it does now. And that's exactly why it was the red light district, because the laws surrounding prostitution are very foggy. In the UK, you can only do it under certain circumstances. It has to be in the person that's selling the service in their home or in their, property. But for that exact reason, it was hard to find CCTV footage of that road for the last night that Shelley may have worked. So they had to look at CCTV around the road to see if she walked on any roads on her way there. And they did. They found Shelley on this CCTV footage. This is the most recent footage they had of her at 10 p.m. on the night of her disappearance. Shelley walks up Sunbridge Road and then turns round and walks back down. So this footage was released to the public, hoping that maybe it'd jog someone's memory, maybe they would remember seeing that woman in that outfit, But nothing really came up, nothing substantial anyway. There might have been a few leads, but nothing that led police anywhere major. And again, after Shelley still didn't show up for weeks, she still didn't contact her family, her loved ones began fearing the worst once again, that they weren't going to find Shelley Armitage alive. So again, the searches began in wooded areas, bodies of water, looking for her body. Around this time, one of Shelley and Susan's sex worker friends named Suzanne Blamires was starting to get really worried, both for her friend's safety but also for her own as a sex worker on that same street in Bradford. This was two of the women that she worked alongside every single night, both missing without a trace over the course of a year. And Suzanne had a real anxiety about the whole thing. She would stay updated on the cases, she would talk to her mother about them, informing her of any updates. Suzanne Blamires was 36 years old and lived a very similar life to the other women. She fell into drug addictions around 21 years old when she joined the rave scene, so a pretty similar story to Shelley Armitage in that she began experimenting with different types of drugs, eventually found heroin and fell into a serious addiction. And she became so addicted and so desperate for the drugs that she needed money very quickly, and so she started going out onto the red light district in Bradford, and she too fell into this vicious cycle of sex work and drugs. Her mother said that it was a real surprise to learn that Suzanne had started taking drugs and become addicted to drugs, because this girl was so bubbly, so lively, she was so confident. All the way through her teens and early 20s, she was just so hardworking, so determined. She got good grades in school, she wanted to be a nurse when she was older, but then of course she got into this rave scene and she began taking drugs, and that bubbly, lively, hardworking girl was completely stripped away from the family. Her parents didn't really know what to do to help her. Of course, at the time in 2009, the information and education for parents wasn't quite what it is today. I mean, today it's still not great. But the only thing that Suzanne's parents could really think to do was to lock her in the house. Physically keep her in there with them so that they know she's not out on the streets, she's not taking drugs. I mean, Suzanne still found her ways eventually. This wasn't a long-term solution, locking her in the house. It had worked for one night, but they can't lock her in the house forever, and they didn't. I'm not saying that they did that. This wasn't an abusive technique. It really did seem from my research like this was a struggling, desperate family, and that was their last resort because they couldn't think of any other way to help their daughter. Her mother said that confident, sociable, outgoing girl that she once knew completely disappeared, and Suzanne lost her whole social life. She described it like a merry-go-round. So she would go onto the streets, she would do the sex work, she would get the money, she would use that money to go buy drugs, she would take the drugs, have the high, sleep off the come down, and then wake up the next day and do the exact same thing again. Go to work, get the money, spend it on drugs. The only people she ever really saw was her mother. and, you know, close family, but she didn't really have any friends anymore other than the women that she worked on the same street as, but even then, she's not seeing them for a lot of the night. But Suzanne was pretty close with her mother. They were like best friends, and she often stayed round at her house, which is exactly what she did on May 20th of 2010. The following morning, her mother dropped Suzanne round at her own house, and Suzanne said that she would call her mother later on that day. So her mother left for work, but she never got that call later on. But her mother didn't worry too much, you know. She thought, well, maybe she just forgot, you know. It wasn't entirely out of Suzanne's character to forget a phone call here or there. I think a lot of people would. So her mother just expected a call the next day. Maybe Suzanne had gotten busy and she couldn't call. However, when the next day rolled round and there was still no call, and then around 4 p.m, Suzanne's boyfriend came and knocked on her mother's door and said, have you seen Suzanne at all for a while? And her mother said, well, no, I was supposed to call her last night, but she never called. Her boyfriend said that he'd been to her flat, she wasn't there, he'd tried calling her phone, she wasn't answering, and now everything pieced together seemed very, very concerning. She wasn't answering anyone, she wasn't turning up at home. So the two of them reported Suzanne Blamires as missing, and once again a search began, and all of her family, all of her loved ones are campaigning for anyone that knows any information to come forward. And it wasn't long before police actually got their first lead, a phone call from someone that had seen something. The person that made this phone call to the police was a caretaker in a block of flats in Bradford named Homefield Court. He'd been doing his regular weekly check of the CCTV cameras when he saw something very concerning in one of the corridors. He saw a man and a woman getting out of the lift and walking along the corridor. He recognised the man as a resident from that block of flats, but he didn't recognise the woman. Now, this wasn't entirely weird because this man that was seen on the footage often brought back sex workers to his flat, so he just assumed that the woman was a sex worker. So the two of them enter this flat, but a couple of moments later, literally within a minute, at 2:34 a.m, the woman bursts through the door and starts running down the corridor away from the flat, trying to flee. And bursting through the door behind her, chasing after her, was the man that she'd walked in with. Only now, this man was wearing black gloves and he had a huge crossbow in his hands. This man lifted the crossbow and aimed at this woman that is running away from him down the corridor. He aims at the woman, shoots an arrow, but he misses. So the man kept running and eventually caught up with the woman. He wrestled her to the ground, and then at point blank range, he raises the crossbow once again and shoots an arrow straight through this woman's head. When the woman stopped moving, the man then grabbed her by the legs and dragged her into his flat 33. And then moments later, he emerges from the flat once again, crossbow still in hand. He walks down to the camera that just caught this whole savage murder on tape, the one that this caretaker is now watching. This man walks straight up to it, looks it straight down the lens, lifts up his crossbow and sticks up his middle finger at the camera. He knew at this point that the cameras had just caught everything that he'd just done. So what else did he have to lose? This was this killer's final gesture as a cold, callous murderer. He knew that this footage would be found one day and would probably be watched by police. It would probably be on the news. And so why not look like a brutal serial killer in it? Why not just look even more tough and scary than you already did? It was just one last kind of, I don't care what I've just done kind of gesture. He was proud of it. He was proud of what he'd just done. And that was his just kind of message to the police or message to the world, message to anyone who might see that video one day. A few hours after all of this went down, the killer then emerged from flat 33 once again, this time carrying a bunch of bin bags and a bunch of like holdalls, rucksacks, and he carried them all downstairs. He then came back upstairs, went back inside the flat, came back out with more bags once again, bunch more bin bags, and took them downstairs as well. I don't know how many times he did this. He did it at least twice, possibly 3-4 times. So as soon as police saw this, they immediately connected it with the disappearance of Suzanne Blamires. And so they brought her family in to watch this CCTV footage, watch their daughter get brutally murdered by this man that didn't care, that went beyond not caring, that went so far as to gesture that way after doing such a thing. And once the family saw this footage, they were able to identify that woman on the tape as Suzanne Blamires. And when they did, police were already on their way to go and arrest the man at flat 33, the man that had just committed this brutal murder on tape. And that is where I'm gonna leave part 1 for now. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure you've got my notifications on so you don't miss when part 2 comes out. Thanks again to Hunter Killer for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you want to get 20% off of your first box, make sure you're going through my link, which is hunterkiller.com/Eleanor Neale, and use code Eleanor at checkout. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a big thumbs up down below. If you want to subscribe, there'll be a link right here to do so. If you want to subscribe to my brand new second channel, there's a link right there. And if you want to watch another true crime video, there's a playlist on screen right now. Bye!